So hopefully your first experience of Waterloo will be very positive. I'm going to hand over to Alan. Alan's one of our lecturers here, and he's very good at these too. And Alan's going to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Again, thank you for coming, and thanks to Paul for getting literally the logistics of this hall together. I was here only yesterday in this room. You won't believe this was a broom club. It's incredible what he's done. It's amazing. I'd like to thank the Guild as well for backing this talk tonight, because they've provided all the things that we need, and to house so many people. We didn't expect anything like this level of interest initially. Can you hear me? No. So we definitely need that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm here just to introduce Dr. Sheldrake. There are a few people here who may not know his CV, shall we say. Dr. Sheldrake is a true iconoclast. He's a practicing scientist, and he regularly questions and challenges the ground rules and the accepted postures of his subject. In doing this, he's consistently presented a great deal of fascinating theories. This is a personal opinion, by the way. Fascinating theories, liberating ideas, and also verifiable evidence. I think that's really fundamental. The experiments back up the theories. Now, this has led to problems because there's a materialistic clergy which do seem to block scientific endeavour in this way. To such an extent that you may have read on the internet about one of the past editors of Nature, the scientific journal, who actually quoted the Pope to Galileo and said that Rupert's books were suitable for burning. Now, he was aware of who he was quoting, but I don't think he got the irony of the reversal of those roles. Now, he called the work a heresy. He didn't say it was unproven. He didn't say that it was unprovable. He said it was a heresy. Now, the Greek root of heresy is a word which means a free thinker, or someone who chooses freely. So I'm sure he got it just right with that, because Rupert is a free thinker. And let me just give you his scientific credentials, because this is very important, and I don't want you to think that he became an iconoclast by being a slacker. He's highly qualified, practicing research scientist, and he informed me just this evening that a great deal of his research is initiated here in Manchester through his research assistant, and she's here tonight, so that's great. So the City of Manchester is heavily involved in the work. He's a very accomplished scholar and a successful author of 10 books and over 80 scientific papers. He was a star pupil at Cambridge as an undergraduate, and he gained the double first and the University Botany Prize. He then studied philosophy and history of science at Harvard, and returned to Cambridge to take a doctorate in biochemistry. He became a fellow of Clare College, a director of studies in biochemistry and cell biology, and a research fellow of the Royal Society. He was researching into plant development and the aging of cells. So he's certainly an authority on the scientific method of inquiry. From 1974 to 1985, he was the principal plant physiologist at the International Crops Research Institute in Hyderabad. It was there that he produced his first book, The New Science of Life. Now, for my society, the Eugene Halliday Society, we're particularly interested in the area that he covered in that, which is the morphic field and morphic resonance, which is a fascinating topic and hypothesis, because it suggests that there is a field of information, an informing field that gives shape, behaviour and pattern to nature. I'm sure Rupert's going to describe it much better than that. But it's ideas like that which have got in the description as iconoclast and heretic. I think he's got a wonderful warmth and goodwill about the science. It's a very humane science that he leads. And he's talking tonight on his new book, which is The Science Delusion. So it's based on the confident scientific belief that science feels it already understands the nature of reality, and then the limitation and the constriction that puts on the spirit of scientific inquiry itself. The books were available for sale outside. I think most of them have gone. But the book is extremely good. This is a personal recommendation. I've read it twice, and it's very, very rewarding. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. I've not been here before, but in the last hour that I have been here, so many people have come up to me and been really friendly. Quite a few have read some of my books. And so it's been a very warm reception. And I feel quite at home in this part of the world because my assistant for the last 18 years, Pam Smart, who lives not actually in Manchester but in Ramsbottom, has been the front line of a lot of my research, and Pam is here with us this evening. So a lot of my experiments, the very first tests of any of my new experiments, are usually done with dogs in Ramsbottom, or with people in Ramsbottom. First and foremost, Pam herself. We try out our human experiments with each other. So this is the epicenter of a lot of my research endeavours. The belief system that dominates institutional science, and has done since the late 19th century, is materialism. It's a worldview, a philosophy of nature, which has become embedded as the kind of orthodoxy of science. And what I want to do this evening is talk about how that belief system is holding science back. At one time it was probably liberating, but now it's become a tremendous straitjacket for scientific thinking, and it's in conflict with what I think is essential to science, namely the spirit of free inquiry. So there's a conflict between free inquiry, which is what I think science is primarily about, and a belief system, the scientific worldview, which is really just a philosophy of nature. Now, most scientists don't know that what they believe is a belief system. They think everyone else has belief systems. They simply know the truth. And this is not a belief system that is inculcated, like kind of scientific catechisms and stuff. It's something that scientists pick up during their education by a kind of intellectual osmosis. And the materialist belief system is effectively the default belief system of all educated people. It sort of pervades the entire educational system, except for pockets here and there, but it is the basic default intellectual theory. Most people want to seem modern and scientific, and that means they become materialists without knowing it. Now, what I do in my book is to take the 10 dogmas of materialism and turn them into questions, and look at the dogmas themselves scientifically. What happens if you look at these in terms of science, logic, reason, and evidence? And the answer is that not one of them stands up to scrutiny for very long. I won't have time to go through all 10 dogmas this evening, but I'm just going to outline what they are to start with, and then I'll discuss some of them. The 10 dogmas are: 1. Nature is mechanical or machine-like. Everything in nature is effectively mechanistic. Dogma 2. Matter is unconscious. Dogma 3. The total amount of matter and energy is always the same. There's the principle of conservation of matter and energy. Everyone who's done science at school will have learned that. Dogma 4. The laws of nature are fixed. They were the same at the time of the Big Bang, they're the same today, and they'll be the same forever. And so are the constants of nature fixed. The speed of light, the gravitational constant, and so on. That's why they're called constants. Number 5, nature is purposeless. There's no purposes in nature, there's no purpose in evolution. It's just blind chance that's produced everything we know. There's no purpose anywhere. Number 6, biological inheritance is material. It's genetic, or more recently, epigenetic material modifications of the DNA or of the proteins around it. Number 7, memories are stored inside the brain as memory traces, and of course are wiped out at death. That's an assumption which is basically a dogmatic assumption of science, but that's one that almost everybody agrees with because they've never thought there could be an alternative. So even non-materialists usually buy into that one. Then the mind is inside the head. Mental activity is brain activity, and it's all inside your head. That's number 8. Number 9, psychic phenomena are illusory. Obviously, if the mind's inside the head, your intentions and thoughts can't have any influence at a distance except through what you do and say. Therefore, psychic phenomena are impossible. Therefore, all the evidence for them is flawed or fraudulent. And that's the attitude of so-called skeptics. There are skeptic organizations where they take that for granted as their starting point, and their job then is to debunk any claims of the paranormal. And dogma 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Of course there are alternative therapies, complementary therapies, but they don't really work. If they appear to work, it's only because people would have got better anyway, or it's all the placebo effect. The only kind that really works is official orthodox medicine, the kind that's taught in medical schools, the kind of research that the Medical Research Council funds. It spends £1 billion a year of our money on medical research, and 100% of it is on mechanistic medicine, not a penny on alternative or complementary medicine. And then they say, well, there's no evidence for it, but where's the research? Well, it's easy to see why there isn't that much research. If you deprive it of funding, it's kind of circular system. And the NHS is opening up a little bit to alternative and complementary therapies, but by and large, the bulk of it is still based on the mechanistic model. The human body is a machine that works on physics and chemistry, therefore medicine is about the physics and chemistry of the body, surgery to do with the physical structure, chemistry, drugs to do with everything else. And of course they do work up to a point, and they work very well in many ways, and many of us are beneficiaries of them. But is that all? The official view is yes, that's all. Okay, well, what I'm going to do to start with is look first of all at the mechanistic theory, the idea that nature is mechanical. And it's very important in all these areas to get things into a historical perspective. The machine theory of nature has been orthodox since the 17th century. The mechanistic revolution of the 17th century was a revolution precisely because it took the view that nature is mechanical. Before that, nobody thought nature was a machine. The standard view in Europe, taught in all the European universities in this country, Oxford and Cambridge, and everywhere else in Europe, was that nature is organic. The Earth is Mother Earth, the whole cosmos is a living cosmos. The stars and planets have intelligences, angelic intelligences connected to them. Animals and plants have souls, and the human soul shares a lot of its characteristics with animals and plants. That was what was all through the medieval university system. And St. Thomas Aquinas, who in the 12th century created a great synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian theology, modified Aristotle's views a bit, but basically taught what Aristotle had taught in Greece, that all living beings have souls. All plants have souls. The soul of the plant is the form of its body that shapes the growing plant. Animals have vegetative or plant-like souls that shape their growing embryos and maintain body in its body form. In addition, animals have what was called the animal soul, which gives them their instincts, movements, sensitivity, behavior. And that animal soul is part of animal nature. Each animal has its own kind of soul. And of course the English word animal comes from the Latin word for soul, anima. Then humans have a vegetative soul like plants that shapes the body, an animal soul that gives us our animal nature because our senses and our emotions are very similar to those of other animals. But in addition, an intellectual or rational soul which is to do with conscious thought and language and reason and mathematics. So this was the view in the Middle Ages, and it was exactly that view that the mechanistic theory rejected, and which is why it was a revolution. They said, no, everything is not like an organism, it's like a machine. Animals and plants are machines, they haven't got souls, they're inanimate machines, and human bodies are inanimate machines as well. We are, as Richard Dawkins puts it, lumbering robots. We're just machines. In modern parlance, our minds are like computers which are genetically programmed. The point about this machine theory was that for the founding fathers of modern science in the 17th century, Copernicus, well, in the 16th century, Copernicus, in the 17th century, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, all of them were Christians, and all of them thought that by treating nature as a machine, they were actually enhancing the dignity and power of God, because instead of nature running itself with its own purposes and goals, if it was a machine, then it had to be designed and controlled by a mind outside it, just as human minds are designed and controlled by humans. So it created a kind of mechanistic theology, God as the divine engineer and mathematician, which fitted very well for an age that turned into the industrial age, a machine-making age, where machinery became the main thing, the main image that was projected onto nature. So it was a new image of God as well. But if nature had no purposes, God had purposes. Nature didn't have any ability to design itself. God designed it from outside, just as a human designs a machine and makes it from outside. So God designed the world machine, set it in motion at the beginning, and it's continued in motion like a machine ever since. That's the basic mechanistic worldview. It was already well developed in the 17th century. And because nature's a machine, it can't have any purposes of its own. Machines don't have purposes of their own. They just do what you want them to do. You get into a car. If it's in working order, it'll go where you want it to go. It doesn't have any idea of its own about where it wants to go. But horses, if you get on the horse, then it's a very different matter. They do have an idea. And for those of you who watch the Grand National, it's some of them. I was in a sweepstake, and my bet was on what's it called, synchronisation. The only horse that was very unsynchronised. It didn't want to go to the starting post. It threw its rider off, its jockey off. Horses are not like machines because they do have ideas and purposes of their own. That's the difference. So, when this idea was put forward, they thought of the universe as like clockwork. But we've now entered a completely different world, a new cosmology. The Big Bang Theory, which became orthodox in 1966 in science, says that the universe began very, very small, less than the size of a head of a pin, and it's been growing, expanding and cooling ever since. And as it does so, new forms and structures appear within it: stars, galaxies, planets, life on this planet at least. It's much more like a developing embryo. The Big Bang is much more like the hatching of the cosmic egg. In fact, the first person to propose it, Father George Lemaitre, a Belgian priest and cosmologist, thought of it as a primal egg that hatched into the beginning of the universe, and it's like an organism growing. The Big Bang Theory was actually opposed by most scientists for years, precisely because it implied a creation event. In fact, it was seen as a Roman Catholic conspiracy, and most scientists thought they had to oppose it because it was thought up by a Roman Catholic priest, and it was endorsed in the 1950s by one of the popes. So they thought this must be wrong. However, the evidence became overwhelming, and it turned out the universe had begun in the Big Bang, and very small, and it's been growing and expanding ever since. It's much more like an organism than a machine. And the Earth itself, Gaia, is much more like an organism than a machine, according to the Gaia hypothesis. In fact, most of nature is more like organisms than machines. The only things that are really like machines are machines themselves. And everything else in nature is much more organic. So the revolutionary idea here, if you question the machine theory, is to say, well, why can't living organisms be living organisms? Why have they got to be machines? When you realise that, you realise this isn't a theory that's been backed up with vast amounts of evidence to many decimal places. It's a metaphor. It's only a metaphor. And it's bedazzled everybody for so long that we forced our entire worldview into one metaphor, the projection of one human obsession, making machinery onto all of nature. It simply doesn't fit. Even in the 18th century, David Hume, best remembered for his scepticism about religion, was equally sceptical about the machine theory of nature. He said it makes no sense to see the universe as a machine. It's far more like an animal or a plant, an organism. So even among skeptics in the 18th century, machine theory was being questioned. But it's remained the dominant orthodoxy ever since, so everything's got to be mechanistic. But we don't have to believe it. In some areas it provides appropriate metaphors, in most areas it doesn't. Part of that was the second dogma, matter is unconscious. Because what René Descartes, one of the founding fathers of modern science, did in the 1620s and 30s, was to say, nature's a machine, animals and plants are machines, human bodies are machines, they're unconscious and inanimate. Matter is inanimate and unconscious. It's defined as unconscious. The only exception in the whole of nature was the human rational mind, which was spiritual, not in space and time, and completely separate from matter, however, interacting with it in a mysterious way in a small region of the brain, the pineal gland. That was Descartes' theory, and it's often called Cartesian dualism, because it involves a duality of spirit and matter, and of course humanity and the rest of nature, because only we have these rational minds, feelings, emotions, hopes, etc., whereas animals, from Descartes' point of view, are just machines. He pioneered vivisection without anaesthetics in animals, because he said, of course, they can't feel pain, so it's perfectly all right to cut open the heart of a dog and put your finger in it and find out what's going on while it's still beating. That attitude to animals and plants is what underlies modern agribusiness and industrial farming and factory farming. It's the mainstream attitude still in biology and the whole of science. But humans were supposed to be completely different. Matter was supposed to be utterly unconscious, and we alone had conscious minds. In the 19th century, a materialist attitude became predominant. Materialists are mechanists, but they go one step further. And what they say is that the dualism Descartes had, where there was material nature which is all mechanical and unconscious, and then on the other side there was spiritual reality, which included human minds, angels and God, which were non-material, spiritual and completely separate and different. The materialists said, we don't want angels and God, we don't like two things, two's too many, we just want one. So there's only one reality, matter, and consciousness is just a product of matter. So all matter is unconscious, and consciousness is nothing but matter in some form. And there's no God and there's no angels. So materialism is inherently atheistic. And when Richard Dawkins takes it for granted, he takes it for granted as a truth. Then if you take it for granted as a truth, then the deduction there's no God, the whole of religion's nonsense, follows within one simple logical step. But it's simply an assumption, and the assumption that matter's unconscious is an assumption that gets scientists into terrible problems, because we're conscious. We can't deny that we're conscious. The whole of science depends on human consciousness. So how can we be conscious if matter, of which our brains are made, is unconscious, and totally unconscious with not a trace of consciousness in it? This causes what's called in the philosophy of mind the hard problem. The problem is to explain how we can be conscious in an unconscious universe. And philosophers of mind, materialist philosophers, who are the majority today, have several options. One of them is to say, well, consciousness doesn't exist. That position is called eliminative materialism. Consciousness doesn't exist. we talk about it, but the language is meaningless. The only real description is neuroscience, what's going on in the brain, nerve impulses and so forth. Well, that doesn't command a majority view, but it is one of the most extreme forms. The more usual form is epiphenomenalism. The consciousness is just secreted by the brain as a kind of, it doesn't do anything. It's like a shadow that doesn't do anything. All the real causes happen in the brain. But it happens to exist, but it doesn't do anything. And the third position is that consciousness is an illusion. It's an illusion that is produced by matter to make us feel that we're important. That's the latest evolutionary theory of consciousness by my friend Nicholas Humphrey. It makes us feel important, and it's an illusion that has a useful role because it gives us a reason to get up in the morning and carry on living and so on. But it's still functionless otherwise. The problem is that to say that consciousness is an illusion doesn't explain consciousness, it presupposes it, because illusion is a mode of consciousness. So it's an intractable problem. The very existence of consciousness is an intractable problem for materialists, which is why scientists ignored it entirely until quite recently. In the 20th century, the leading school of psychology in Britain and America was behaviorism. Behaviorism said we'll ignore consciousness in psychology. In science, psychology must only study scientifically measurable phenomena, namely the movements of muscles and the secretion of glands. So behaviorism is just about observable behavior, and consciousness is ignored entirely. Well, that was the dominant school of, if you went to university until the 1980s, that was what they were teaching in almost all universities. It was then replaced by cognitive neuroscience. The mind is a computer. It's just processing the information. That has now been superseded by a slightly more sophisticated view where they've discovered, and it's hailed as a big new discovery, that humans have emotions and emotions can influence thought. So it's not just like a computer. It's embodied, and emotions play a part in thinking. This is the absolute leading edge of current philosophy. Anyway, it's a mess, philosophy of mind and consciousness studies, because this intractable problem won't go away. As soon as consciousness got onto the scientific agenda, starting around the 1980s, this problem became more and more intense. Some materialist philosophers, notably Galen Strawson, who's a British materialist philosopher, are beginning to break ranks. He's already broken ranks, and he said this simply won't do. And to say that consciousness has evolved as if the light bulb of consciousness gets switched on in human brains at some point in history, e.g. ancient Greece, is simply dualism in a new form. To say it emerges as something totally different is simply an evolutionary-based form of dualism. His argument is the only way we can deal with it is to say that the potential for mind or consciousness is present in all matter. And that is called panpsychism. Pan meaning everywhere, psychism meaning mind or soul. Of course, it's not a new view, but he wrote a key paper a few years ago in the Journal of Consciousness Studies called "Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism?" And he answered yes, it must. That's the only way forward. And this is now a growing movement in philosophy of mind. It's still very controversial, but I myself think it's the only way forward too. I agree with him, but it's not an original view, it's what everyone in the Middle Ages believed, and it's what all Greek philosophers believed, or most of them. It's also a view that was put forward in European philosophy very soon after Descartes. The next generation, philosophers realized that this extreme dualism wouldn't really work. And there were two very important panpsychist philosophers in the 17th century. One was Leibniz, who, together with Newton, invented the infinitesimal calculus. And he argued that the universe is made up of centers of organization, monads, units, which are both bodies and minds, and each monad reflects the universe from its own point of view. Since every monad is in a different place, you're a monad, I'm a monad, we're all in different places, we all see the universe from a slightly different point of view. And not only humans, but animals, and also physical structures like crystals are monads and reflect the universe from their own point of view. That was Leibniz. Spinoza thought that everything in nature had both body and mind, and the whole of nature was both body and mind combined. And the feature of mind was desire or striving, and that there's a striving seen in all of nature, which includes gravitational force. It's a kind of striving of the mind in nature, and that nature is what he called it, Deus sive natura, God or nature. The consciousness and the body, the material world, are two sides of the same thing. So that was the cyclist philosophy in the 18th century. There were many more in the 17th century, more in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most interesting one in the 20th century was Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead was a philosopher who pointed out that nature is much better thought of as organisms than machines. He was an early proponent of the organismic or organic philosophy of nature. But he also dealt with the question of mind and matter. He thought that electrons and atoms must have some kind of mental life, and their mental life was expressed in feelings, and their feelings included attraction and repulsion. If you think about it, most of our emotions in the end boil down to attractions and repulsions. And electrons have them too. They're attracted towards positive charges and repelled by negative charges. They have attractions and repulsions. They're not just neutral blocks of stuff. But the most interesting point of Whitehead's philosophy was the way he saw the relation of the mental and the physical aspect of everything. He saw the relationship not being in space, which we usually talk of it in spatial terms, the inner life, the outer world, as if the mind's the inside, the body and the material world of the outside. He thought the relationship was in time. That the pole, the mental and the physical pole, had differences in time. The mental pole was at the future, the physical pole at the past. And mental pole is concerned with possibilities and choices. If you think about it, most of our consciousness is to do with possibilities and choices. And when you're thinking about possibilities, they coexist in your mind. They're not realities in the sense they haven't happened yet, but they have a kind of reality as virtual futures or virtual possibilities. Like coming here this evening, all of us made a decision to come here this evening. There were many other things we could have been doing this evening, but we decided to come here. And while we were deciding those possibilities, we were involved in a future realm, a realm of possibility. When we make the decision and implement it, it becomes a fact. And someone could photograph this room. In fact, it is being photographed or videoed. And it's a record of an observable fact that we all have mass, we occupy physical space, we're scientifically observable facts. But in a sense, from the point of view of the decision to come here, that decision happened in the future, and this has now happened, and it's in a sense it's in the past that we made the decision to come. We're here. I think Whitehead's idea of the relation of mind and body is extremely interesting and enormously provocative and with many implications. I don't have time to go into them all this evening because I've got to get through lots of other delusions. But I discuss this in my book, and you can read more about it there. But just one more point about matter being unconscious. The usual assumption is it's all unconscious. That's the standard default scientific position. And most of the discussion of panpsychism by Galen, Strauss and Whitehead and so on has been about electrons and atoms. Well, if they have a kind of mental life, it's probably very, very remote from ours and obviously tremendously simple. But what about looking at the other end of the scale of magnitude? What about the sun, the galaxy? Could the sun be conscious? Could the whole galaxy have a kind of mind that includes all the solar systems within it? Now, as soon as you ask that, you're in new territory, at least for most people. Certainly when I first thought of it, I was in new territory. What if the sun is conscious? All traditional cultures have taken it for granted. In Hinduism, they have one of the great mantras of Hinduism, the Gayatri mantra, is a prayer to the sun for illumination of our thoughts and meditation. Many yoga, there's a whole yoga exercise, Surya Namaskar, it's prostrations to the sun. Many people do in the morning, I do myself, which is a a salutation to the sun. All over the world, the Greeks thought that the sun was a god, Apollo. All over the world, people think the sun is a living being. Even children do, and that's why they draw smiley faces on the sun. But grown-ups like us are supposed to dismiss all that as primitive, superstitious thought that we've grown out of. But have we grown out of it because we've carefully considered the possibility and considered whether the sun could be conscious, and the idea that it's not conscious, and weighed up the alternatives? Well, most people certainly haven't. They've never let that thought enter their mind because it's a taboo from the mechanistic point of view. It's one of the areas where the whole taboo shapes what you can think. It prevents whole areas of thought. It's not thinkable within that framework. It's nonsense, it's rubbish, it's stupid, it's ridiculous. Don't be ridiculous. I tried this out on the Astronomer Royal when he was president of the Royal Society. He's an old friend of mine, Martin Rees. And I was staying with him and over breakfast, I said to him, Martin, have you ever considered the possibility that the sun might be conscious? He said, what? I said, the idea that the sun might be conscious. It's certainly not. And continued, we changed the subject. But it's not the agenda. It's not on the menu. And yet, what if the sun is conscious? If you think it through, then what's it think about? Well, one thing would be its body, the whole solar system. Another would be its peer group, the other stars in the galaxy. And what if there's a galactic mind? What if there's a purpose and an organic development process going on in the galaxy? And what if clusters of galaxies? And what if the whole universe is conscious, which is what everyone always used to think, certainly the Greeks and early Christian theologians. You lived in a living universe. There was a world soul. This is all off limits for materialism, but not because materialism has a brilliantly successful theory of consciousness. It has no theory of consciousness at all, except to try and deny it, even in our own case, in an extremely implausible way. So, it's not as if this is one of the greatest triumphs of science, again proved to lots of decimal points. It isn't. It's simply an assumption. And it's a very inadequate and questionable assumption, and life gets much more interesting if you question it. And there's no one who can stop you, really, if you just break out. You break free. If someone says to you, well, how can you prove the sun's conscious? You can ask them back, well, how can you prove it's not? And so it's not as if there's an answer that's the right answer and the wrong answer. It's an open question. So then, matter and energy, the total amount of matter and energy is fixed. Dogma 3. Now, this is the one dogma that I had never challenged until I started writing this book. I'd assumed it must be true because I'd learned it at school, no one had ever challenged it, or was universally accepted. And I thought, actually, it would be quite good to find that one of the 10 dogmas is true, because then it would look as if I'm not being biased. It would be nice to find one of them is true and unquestionable. But it turned out that this is the shakiest of them all. It's a house of cards built on foundations of sand. It's extremely questionable. The first thing to realize is this is not something that's been established through people spending years and years with chemical balances and calorimeters measuring everything experimentally. It started as a philosophical assumption in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the materialist philosophers, the pioneers of modern materialism, said that reality is material, the only reality is material, and it's made up of lots of little bits, the atoms, and the atoms are eternal, so they can't be broken up by definition. It was a brilliant theory. It was incredibly speculative. There was not a shred of evidence for it, but it was very fruitful later in the history of science. Brilliant theory, but a theory nonetheless. It was just a theory. It was a rival theory to Plato's theory that the eternal reality is made up of ideas or forms in the transcendent realm. Ancient Greek philosophers all agreed there was an eternal reality, but they had different theories as to what it was. And the materialists said that it was made up of lots of atoms because they can't be created or destroyed. Then the total number's always the same. That's the inner germ, the principle of conservation of matter. deduced as a logical deduction from the theory, not measured. And in the 17th century, when Descartes and people thought of God making the world machine and starting it in motion, pressing the start button and impelling it into motion, they thought that the motion in the universe was impelled by God and was all God-given. So the total amount of movement or energy or change, what we now call energy, in the universe must be the same because it was God-given, and being eternal, God being eternal, his energy, conferred energy, must be eternal. So it was a theological assumption. It wasn't until the 1850s that scientists brought together different areas of thought in physics and biology to the law of conservation of matter and energy. It's the first law of thermodynamics, the principle of conservation of energy, 1851. So that brought together conservation of motion, kinetic energy, thermal energy, work energy, all the different kinds of energy. It was a great synthesis, but it was based on the assumption it must be the same, based on this theological assumption. So, is it always the same? Well, you can't ask that question if there's a law that says it is. But physicists themselves don't bother that much with the law. In the 1980s, it turned out that they couldn't explain the way that galaxies work and react with each other. They seem to be attracted to each other more than they should be. If you add up all the mass in the galaxy, the stars, the planets, make a generous allowance for black holes, brown dwarfs, and so forth, just add up all the mass that's in a galaxy, and it turns out there's far too little to explain the way galaxies interact or the way they keep stars in orbit within them. There seems to be much more gravitational pull than there ought to be. So, how could they deal with that? One way we could say, well, maybe galaxies aren't just gravitational. Maybe they're like organisms and don't have to be just organized by gravity. But that's not on the agenda because they must be mechanistic systems. So, how do you account for these gross anomalies where there's far too much gravitational attraction than there ought to be? Well, it's quite simple. You hypothesize or invent a form of matter that no one's ever observed, dark matter, and you put in exactly the right amount to make the equations balance. And if the observations require a different equation, you change the amount of dark matter. There's now roughly 5 times as much dark matter as regular matter, according to this theory. And the amount is adjusted at will to balance the equations. The evidence for it is that it makes the equations balance. There's no independent evidence except the observation that these galaxies and stars don't behave as they ought to if existing theories are true. So dark matter is there, and they've been trying to find out what it is. Some people think it's lots of black holes, other people think it might be WIMPs, weakly interacting massive particles. So there's a variety of theories. It's still hotly debated as to what dark matter is, but it's generally assumed it exists. Some people say, well, if you change the laws of gravitation, we can get rid of it, and we can just have a modified gravitational theory. If they're right, then all this dark matter will suddenly disappear. Well, what about the conservation of matter and energy? If physicists can invent 5 times more than we've ever known about before, and then perhaps abolish it in a few years' time, is it conserved? Can it turn into ordinary matter? Who knows? No one has a clue. And then, even worse, as a result of all this dark matter that suddenly appeared in the universe, it meant the universe had more gravitation than ever before. So that meant that as the universe expands, suddenly there's lots of extra mass in the universe. That means that it should be pulled by gravitation back in. So the universe would stop expanding and then begin to contract again faster and faster till it all ends in a black hole, a giant black hole. That would be the end of the universe, the reverse of the Big Bang, known in the trade as the Big Crunch. So the idea that the universe might contract again was a big issue in the 1990s. But in the late 1990s, it was discovered that the most distant stars and galaxies seem to be accelerating instead of decelerating. They're moving apart faster and faster as time goes on, not slower and slower. So how do you fix that one? Well, easy. There must be an extra form of energy in the universe universe, dark energy, which is pushing the universe apart. And the current estimate is that the total amount of dark matter and dark energy is 96% of all matter and energy in the universe. The energy that we all learned about at school, the matter and energy, is less than 4% of reality. And if that's rigidly conserved to many decimal places, it's still the question of, how does it interact with all these other forms of matter and energy? Could they give rise to regular energy? Could one form be converted into another? These are open questions, and nobody knows. And even worse, from the conventional point of view, the equations of dark energy say that the energy density per unit volume is the same as given by a term in Einstein's equation called cosmological constant. Now, if the density is the same, it means there's the same amount of energy per unit volume. But if the universe is expanding, there's more volume. Therefore, there's more energy. And it turns out the universe is a perpetual motion machine. It's expanding, and as it expands, it creates more dark energy that makes it expand more. That's the current theory. So, is it really true that dark matter, that matter and energy are rigidly conserved to many decimal places? Well, it's an act of faith at best, and it certainly has rendered this question, almost irrelevant, because there's so much more matter and energy, and we don't know how much, and the amounts keep changing. Who knows? There's also, in physics, something called the zero-point field, the quantum vacuum field, which is an essential part of quantum theory. The quantum vacuum field creates virtual photons to explain all electromagnetic interactions. So if I pull a compass out of my pocket, and I look at it, and I find out where north is, it's over there, the compass needle is interacting with the Earth's magnetic field through virtual photons that are being created and destroyed from the quantum vacuum field. While you're sitting on your seat, the fact you're not going through it is because your bottom is repelled by the chair. And that's, in the end, an electromagnetic repulsion. And underneath every one of your bottoms is a dense cloud of virtual photons that's tearing and dissipating from the quantum vacuum field. When you stand up, this dense cloud will disappear, and you'll have a much denser one under your feet as more weight falls on your feet. It's full of the quantum vacuum field. So some people have said, well, maybe we could tap it. Maybe we could have energy devices that tap it. Well, there's lots of inventors out there working in garages and in sheds and in privately funded small companies who claim to have exactly such things, above unity or free energy devices that tap the quantum vacuum field or other forms of matter and energy that are out there. Do they get funded by the government or energy companies? No, they don't, because the minute they they get small private investors who go for it, but the minute they go to approach a big energy company like E.ON or something, they say, we've got this device that's an above unity device. If the person they talk to doesn't laugh at them straight away, they ring their science advisor and they say, oh no, not another crank with a perpetual motion machine. And so the oldest taboo in science is against perpetual motion machines. It started with Galileo. So there's a tremendously deep taboo. And yet, there are people who claim they can produce energy without nuclear power, without wind power, without fossil fuels, that could transform the economy of the world. You'd think that the scientific world would be saying, incredible, let's see whether these work or not. Not at all. Completely beyond the pale. If you look on the internet, do a search on above unity or free energy devices, you'll find a jungle out there. And some of them are probably fraudulent, some of them are probably cranks. But could there be something in it? Well, how would you find out? Well, my suggestion is a prize for the best above unity device, say £1 million prize. I'm talking to some wealthy foundation in London in the next few weeks, and I'm going to pitch this idea to them. And say, okay, we'll have teams of engineers and chemical engineers and electrical engineers who will test it fairly. They're not going to try and debunk you. They want to see if it really works. And if any of them are above unity, they'll get the prize. If several are above unity, the one that's best will get the prize. If none of them are above unity, no one will get the prize. And you see, the conventional people ought to welcome this, because they predict, in fact, they could bet on it, Ladbrokes could open a book on this, And they'd be prepared, how much would they be prepared to bet that no one has an above unity device? They could put their money where their mouth is, and they might win. But then for the first time they'd have some evidence to support their point of view, so they ought to welcome this, a fair, open test. And if it turns out some of these devices really work, the world would be a different place. But this isn't happening, it hasn't happened yet because there's a taboo. In all of these areas, the taboo is a taboo on our thinking. It's like a prison for thought. Anything that goes beyond it is ridiculous. It's sneered at, jeered at, rejected. Okay, now the idea that the laws and constants of nature are fixed. The next dogma, dogma 4. Dogma 4. Made sense when scientists thought the universe was eternal. In the 19th century, they thought it was governed by eternal mathematical laws and made up of eternal matter and energy. But the Big Bang theory throws that into doubt. If the whole universe is evolutionary, as it now seems to be, what about the eternal laws of nature? Were they all there at the moment of the Big Bang, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code? Did they all suddenly appear from nowhere at the moment of the Big Bang, along with all the matter and energy of the universe? That's the usual assumption. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle, and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. If the universe evolves, why can't the laws of nature evolve? Everything else does. Why not them too? And in fact, as soon as you start thinking about it, you realize the idea of law of nature is very questionable. Law is a metaphor. It's based on human laws. Only humans have laws in the universe, as far as we know, and not even all humans. Tribes have customs. Civilized societies have laws. In the 17th century it made sense because there was a kind of political metaphor. God was like the cosmic emperor who made up eternal laws and who then made sure everything in nature obeyed them by being omnipotent. So he acted as a kind of universal law enforcement agency. But in an evolving universe, do they have to be laws? My own view is that they're habits, that we live in a world with a kind of memory, and most of nature is a world of habits. We're creatures of habits, and so is all nature. Animals are creatures of habits. And electrons and protons and crystals have habits. This theory would say that if you crystallize new compounds for the first time, you won't be an existing habit from the way they crystallize. The more you do it, the easier it should get as the habit builds up, and that's just what seems to happen. Now, I've discussed this in much detail in my books, A New Science of Life and the Presence of the Past, so I'm not going to go into my morphic resonance theory this evening, because I'm trying to cover the bigger picture. But I just say that the idea of the laws of nature has an alternative to it. They're evolving habits, and I think it's a much more plausible, it fits the facts much better. I'll just mention briefly the constants being fixed, because it's simply assumed that the constants are fixed too. The speed of light c and gravitational constant g, big G, as physicists, capital G, it's called big G by physicists. These are supposed to be constant. But what if you actually measure them? What happens to measurements? In my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, I took a look at the physical constants and asked the question, are they constant? If you actually look at the measurements, they're not constant. The speed of light all around the world dropped by about 20 kilometers per second between 1928 and 1945. Then it went up again. And then people measured it all around the world. There were very small errors. So it's not as if there was a huge error and it dropped within the error limits. The measurements between 1928 and 45, tiny error bars. They went up in tiny error bars again. So I went to see the head of the National Physical Laboratory to discuss this with him. He's our man on the International Commission on Metrology. Metrology is the science that deals with these things. And he was a very nice man, and I said to him, well, what do you make of this drop in the speed of light between 1928 and 1945? I said, could the speed of light have actually changed? Could it be cyclical or altered? No, of course not. I said, well, why not? It's a constant. So I said, well then, how do you explain it? I said, all around the world. people were getting these measurements, were they just fudging their results to get the result that they wanted because they thought that was the right answer? And he said, well, you have uncovered one of the most embarrassing episodes in the history of our science. And so I said, well, what is your explanation? He said, we don't like to use the word fudging. And I said, well, what word do you like to use? He said, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. People correct themselves until they get the expected value. That's what, how do we know that's not going on today? He said, oh, well, in the case of light, we're sure it's not. I said, well, why not? He said, well, we fixed it by definition in 1970. The International Commission fixed it by definition, and then they altered the definition of the meter in terms of the speed of light. So if the speed of light changes, the meter will change too, and we won't notice the difference. But in the case of the gravitational constant, big G, the variations are enormous. I mean, they're over 1%, even in the last 10 years. And these are supposed to be to many places of decimals. In fact, they give the values to many places of decimals with, 0.00001% error or something. Then another value comes along that's 1% different. What's going on? I think it's possible that these constants are actually changing. The gravitational constant might change according to the Earth's position in relation to the galaxy. If dark matter really exists, if we go through a cloud of it, a denser cloud of it, it will affect these measurements. So since the last nearly 20 years I've been trying to persuade physicists to look at the data in their laboratory notebooks. They take it on different days, then they average it, and then different labs send in their values and they average those to get the latest, best value. What if you look at the actual data? What if they're all high on one day and low on another? What if they show correlated cycles? This might show fluctuations in G. Will they do that? No, it's a constant. So no one will look at the data. I've not been able to persuade anyone to do it. It's all there in the files, in physics departments. Here again, there's a thought, an idea, an ideology which imprisons thinking. And it'd be so much more interesting if they fluctuated. In fact, I think all the constants may fluctuate a bit within narrow limits. And I think the day will come when, in scientific journals like Nature, you'll have weekly reports, and like stock market reports on the paper. The FTSE is down 6 points, gold's up $12 per ounce and stuff. And we have things like the fine structure constant held constant this week. The charge on the electron was down a bit. The gravitation constant went up. And if they do fluctuate, it would mean there'd be varying qualities of time in the universe. Different things would happen at different times. It wouldn't be blandly uniform. This is possible. Everything else fluctuates. Everything else in science is now recognized to have a kind of chaotic dimension. So this is one of the areas where the idea that it's all fixed, again, is an assumption. There are alternative theories, but they're branded heretical because they don't fit the standard view. The evidence actually favours the idea that there are habits and that they evolve rather than constants and fixed, that constants and laws are fixed. A lot of my own work has been in this field. The next dogma, that nature is purposeless, is, as I've said already, simply an assumption. The idea that evolution is blind chance is not going anywhere, it's ultimately pointless. It's just a belief system. And people like Dawkins use it to attack all religions who believe in its purpose, or even just optimistic people. On the basis of what? Simply an assumption, a metaphor, that it's a machine. I mean, and the idea that there's no purpose in nature is obviously refuted by the fact that we have purposes. Animals have purposes. A hungry dog wants to get to a bone. Birds have purposes. They build nests, even if they're unconscious purposes. Nature is pervaded by purposes. So, again, that's an assumption of a highly questionable kind. Then, the assumption that biological inheritance is all material, it's all in the DNA and in epigenetic modifications of the DNA, or in cytoplasmic inheritance, which is a generally accepted form of inheritance. This again is an assumption. We've been brought up to believe that inheritance is genetic. In fact, most people use the words hereditary and genetic as synonyms. And But it's just a theory. We actually know what DNA does. It codes for the sequence of amino acids in proteins. It doesn't code for the nest-building behavior of the swallow, the orb web-building behavior of the spider, the shape of your nose, or any of those, or the shape, the form or behavior of animals. It just codes for proteins. The assumption is if you've got the right proteins, everything else will follow automatically somehow, in an unexplained way. Well, it is unexplained. And some people, like me, think that a lot of heredity depends on morphic resonance, a kind of collective memory that each species has. Yes.
And so, I mean, obviously we can sort of count the number of people in this room right now. We can say, we can prove that there are so many people in the room because we counted them.
Yes.
So there's a certain sort of degree to which things can be proven. But, I mean, how far does that really go?
Well, the point about science is about testing hypotheses, and so you can't. Most scientists would admit, if pressed, that it's not about truth. It's about testing hypotheses and finding out which fit the facts better than others. So, but there are certain things about the scientific method which will have to be modified in the light of this. For example, the assumption in science that any experiment should be repeatable anywhere at any time is a fundamental assumption in science, the repeatability of experiments. And the reason for that assumption is the implicit assumption that the laws of nature are the same at all times and in all places. Now, if morphic resonance is happening, if you train rats to learn a new trick in one place, then rats all around the world should learn it quicker. If you repeat the experiment, you won't get the same result, they'll learn it quicker. And in fact, that's already been observed. They do learn it quicker. It's a big puzzle for people at first. Well, it still is for a lot of people. But I think this is a morphic resonance effect. If you know about morphic resonance, you design your experiment to take that into account. If you don't know about it, you get puzzling anomalies in your experimental results, which usually people just ignore or brush aside or dismiss as random error. But you can still do science. I mean, I do it myself all the time. I mean, experiments are still possible. You're testing a hypothesis. For example, one of the things that Pam and I are working on at the moment is telephone telepathy. Can people really tell when someone's calling them on the phone? Yes, most people have had the experience. You think of someone, then they call and you say, it's funny, I was just thinking about you. Now, the standard scientific approach to that is to say it's just superstition, it's pure coincidence. You forget all the times you were wrong, you just remember times when by chance you were thinking about something correct. Now that's a hypothesis, never been tested until recently. Most scientists took it for granted, the skeptical hypothesis, evidence-free, it turned out. We've been testing this hypothesis and we have experiments. We have one going now. Actually, all of you can do it, and please do, if you can. It's online on my website, sheldrake.org. Go to the online experiments portal, and there the mobile telephone telepathy test. You log on, you put in the names and mobile phone numbers of two friends. The computer then picks one of the two, gives them a text message, and asks them to ring you at a landline number which is given on the text. So they ring the landline, it's the computer. The computer puts them on hold. Then it rings up the subject. If you're the subject, your phone would ring, caller ID would say telephone telepathy test. And when you answer it, it says, one of your two callers is on the line waiting to speak to you right now. Please guess who it is. Press 1 for Anne, 2 for Bill. So you guess, and as soon as you guess, the line opens up, and you get to speak to them, you get instant feedback. Then after a minute it cuts off because I'm paying for the call. And after a random time it does it again until you've done about 6 of these trials, and then everyone involved gets a text message with the score. Now, here's an example of a hypothesis. You see, my hypothesis is telepathy could be real. Most people have experienced it. It seems to happen. There's lots of evidence for it. The skeptical argument that it's just coincidence has never been tested. So we can test the skeptics would in this experiment that the hit rate would be 50%, more or less chance level. It's just like flipping a coin. It would be, if there's no telepathy, it would be 50%. In fact, it's around 60%, and with hundreds of trials, it's very, very significant statistically. So here's a case where we've got one hypothesis, telepathy doesn't exist, another that it does, and the evidence strongly favours telepathy existed. Now, there could be another hypothesis, say, well, it's not telepathy, it's some kind of quantum non-local interconnectedness. You could have another hypothesis that would interpret it differently. But the fact is, the experiment can decide between the hypothesis is nothing's really going on, it's just coincidence, and something's going on. And the data shows something's going on. So in most of science, it's not so much that you establish the truth, it's the matter of you test rival hypotheses and find out which one fits the facts better. And telepathy fits the facts much better than the skeptical hypothesis, which is impossible. Of course, it doesn't happen all the time. People aren't, no one's been right, well, maybe one person's been right 100% of the time when it was tested. She was being tested by my skeptical nemesis, Professor Chris French, in his laboratory. He was astonished when someone got 100% right in his lab. When he did the test, he got 0% right. Yeah.
Okay. One very simple criticism, and one even simpler question.
Yeah.
Firstly, you grossly misrepresent your position right from the start by referring to the laws of science as dogmas. That is straightforwardly perverse. The laws of science are based upon empirical observation. And as empirical observations change, the laws of science will change. Dogma is a totally separate concept, and by confusing the two, you're misrepresenting your entire position. Secondly, what was the transformative experience you had in Hyderabad that led you to dump the foundation of empiricism and to embark upon your depressingly popular brand of mystical magic mysticism?
All right. Well, I'll answer those questions. First of all, the so-called laws of nature, my whole point, everything I've said this evening, is that those laws of nature that I put in the principle of conservation of matter and energy are not based on, they were based on philosophical assumptions. And when the facts
You're misrepresenting the position again.
If you've got a different history of these, I mean, I've looked into the history as explained in my book. If you think they've been done by people very carefully weighing and measuring everything, you're simply wrong. You're deluded if you think that, because it's not true. And so my position is that science does have dogmas, that if as nature evolves, as you rightly say, the so-called laws of nature would change if the laws of nature are just a description of what's happening in nature. Now that's a really important point. Some philosophers of science think that scientific laws are simply descriptions of the way nature is. Since nature evolves, those descriptions would evolve. Well, I have no problem with that at all. But, you see, where I run into the dogmas is, you see, I confront dogmatists all the time in my line of work. It's an occupational hazard. And when I say to people, well, look, when crystals crystallize more frequently, they become easier to crystallize and may even be changed to the melting point, the phenomenon change. They say, that's completely impossible. I say, why? They say crystallization is completely determined by the laws of electromagnetism, quantum theory, thermodynamics, and therefore it can't change. And so the opposition I've had has been entirely dogmatic. I mean, you may not encounter skeptics in the way I do, but I've had arguments with, say, the Dutch skeptic group, who said that the idea that melting points could change was completely false. The data must be false. If I got data, the data must have been misprints, because it's impossible. Why is it impossible? Because the laws of nature are fixed. So, now, they were being dogmatic, and when I meet skeptics who say telepathy is impossible because the mind's inside the brain, most so-called skeptics say that, they're being dogmatic too. If telepathy exists, if the empirical method shows it to exist, then it exists, and the laws of science must try to accept that. Now, if that's your position, I'm with you. If you say it can't exist and that scientists aren't dogmatic, it's simply not true. A lot of them are very dogmatic. And it's not the case that I dump the empirical method. I spend the great majority of my time doing experimental experiments. I mean, I'm doing experiments on telephone telepathy right now. And the empirical method is looking through observations, testing hypotheses. That's exactly what I spend most of my time doing. So I'm not against the empirical method, I'm totally in favour of it. So I think that if you think that scientists are not dogmatic, you have a very idealised view, which is not my experience. And I think if you try out the possibility of telepathy or changing melting points, or the idea that the laws of nature, the natural energy might not be fixed and taken on some of your scientific friends, you'll find instead of saying, that's really interesting, what's the evidence? I think it's much more likely to say it's total rubbish. Much more likely.
Transformative experience?
A transformative experience? What are you referring to, guys?
The experience you presumably had in Hyderabad, which led you to develop morphic resonance and your other distinctive ideas.
All right. Well, I mean, I'm not really here to talk autobiographically, because since you asked, the idea of morphic resonance came to me in Cambridge, not Hyderabad. I was working on plant development. I spent 10 years working on how plant develops. I worked on how the plant hormone auxin is formed in plants and how it's transported by a polar transport system, for which I worked out the molecular mechanism. I worked out how auxin was made. Then I realised if all plants have the same hormone and the same transport mechanism, it doesn't really explain why a beech is different from an egg, or why a flower is different from a leaf. And I then got interested in the developmental biology discussion about form in embryos and plants. And the idea of morphogenetic fields, first put forward in 1920, a major concept in developmental biology, developed by C.H. Wallington in Edinburgh University. René Thom, the French topologist, made mathematical models of morphogenetic fields. Lewis Walter, one of Britain's most materialistic biologists, took up this concept in his idea of positional information. So this was a mainstream idea in developmental biology, and it seemed to me to be the best way to think about form. That's what I was working on. But for me, the question was, how do the fields evolve? Biology evolves, forms evolve. How do they evolve? And when I talk to people who are working on the theory of morphogenetic fields, René Thom, Brown Goodwin at Sussex University at that time, they said if they're fields, they must have equations. If they have equations, the equations must be mathematical, and in that sense they're Platonic. They're kind of eternal Platonic equations, because maths is Platonic, they're relativists. Many mathematicians are. So I said, no, I just can't believe that the morphogenetic fields of Afghan hounds and Pekingese and stuff are all in some kind of Platonic realm beyond space and time. They've always been there. And one of my mathematical modelling friends said, but don't you see, they're just reifications of equations. I said, reifications of equations? I said, do you think the maths is more real than the animals and the plants? He said, of course. I said, then I realised that the mainstream attempt to explain these fields was in terms of eternal equations. I wanted a theory that showed how they would evolve. I then read, the binding moment was reading a book by Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, called Matter and Memory, in which he shows that memory, the idea that it's stored in the brain is just an assumption. It's much more reasonable to think that moving directly across time, the connection across time. And it's that theory that influenced William James, Bertrand Russell, Rupert, Wittgenstein, and there's a mainstream idea in Western philosophy. And I realised that if memory moved across space and time, if a memory influence worked through morphogenetic fields, they could inherit a kind of memory. They could evolve, they could be part of nature, not being governed by eternal matter. That was the revelation, that was the insight. And for several days I was in a hyper-excited state, as I realised so much in nature would make sense with this hypothesis. I discussed it with my colleagues in the biochemistry department tea room, and it went over rather like a lead balloon. I discussed it with my literary and philosophical friends on the high table at Clare. I was a fellow at Clare at the time. And I found some of them very, very interested, and I had a lot of very helpful discussions, mainly with philosophers. And it took me another 8 years before I wrote my first book, because I wasn't sure whether this was true. I realised that to publish a radical idea like this would be the end of my conventional scientific career. Because scientists are not sort of saying, oh, just give us the facts, we're open to anything. It's not the way science works. So I had to feel quite sure. I spent 8 years thinking about it before I wrote my first book in India. So that's the background. And the background was not a dumping of the empirical method, a retreat into mysticism. It was an attempt to carry forward what I thought and still think of as a rational, scientific way of dealing with unexplained phenomena.
Thanks. One more question?
From your work, it seems to suggest the possibility that the morphogenic field is not a local phenomenon, and that it is pan-universal, and events on distant planets and star systems impinge upon the morphogenic field and influence events locally. And this puts me in mind of the 0 point field. Do you think there's a correlation between the two? And in some way, could they be acting in a holographic way in which each part carries the whole?
Yes, well, what's non-local is morphic resonance. The fields are within and around systems, but the resonance, the influence, the memory influence can move across space and time, and possibly even through the whole universe. It's impossible to test that at the moment, but that's my working assumption. Well, in terms of whether it's related to the 0 point field, I just don't know, because too little is known about the 0 point field. There's a philosopher called Erwin Laszlo who thinks that morphic resonance works through the 0 point field. But I'm not sure how far that gets us, because it's in a way obscure. It's, as the alchemists used to say, it's obscurium per obscurius. It's explaining the obscure by the more obscure. I'm not sure, it may be that that's the answer, but we know physicists tell us so little about this field. They use it all the time in quantum electrodynamics as the basis of their quantum calculations. But when you say, what is it? What are its properties? They're extremely elusive. And there's, after all, they think there's another field as well, the Higgs field. The whole of the CERN project to find the Higgs boson, which cost billions and billions of euros to find this elusive particle, is that physics at present has no explanation of mass. The most fundamental of all physical properties is not explained by the contemporary standard model of particle physics. The theory of mass they have is that everything is sort of glued to what's called the Higgs field, a field which has never been detected, by particles called Higgs bosons, which they haven't detected either. And that's why all of us have mass. We're being glued to the place we're in and to our seats and stuff by Higgs bosons ultimately, and this glue, this treacly Higgs field. Well, that's the current theory of mass, and if the Higgs field exists, that's another universal field that connects everything and could be a carrier of morphic resonance. But David Bohm had a different approach. He was a quantum physicist, and he thought that the world we live in is the explicate order, it's the unfolded order, and that there's a kind of holographic implicate order that folds out into the world. The implicate order is not in normal time and space. So he proposed that when things are unfolded into the explicate order also influences the implicate order by an introjection or injection of influence. So if a rat learns a new trick in Greater Manchester, then a rat, then that will be enfolded into the rat implicate order, and rats all over the world should learn it quicker. So his theory comes to exactly the same conclusions as morphic resonance, but it's put in terms of a quantum physics theory. In the new edition of The New Science of Life, there's a dialogue between me and David Bohm on exactly this point. So I leave it open. I think what I'm interested in is a hypothesis that makes predictions. Morphic resonance makes predictions about memory processes, rats learning new tricks, crystals crystallizing quicker, and so on, which can be tested. Exactly how it's explained in terms of the Akashic field of Laszlo, the 0 point energy field, the Higgs field, the implicate order, or in superstring and end theory, one of which has 10, the other has 11 dimensions. These are mainstream parts of contemporary theoretical physics. In fact, they dominate. One has 10, the other has 11 dimensions. Extra dimensions come cheap in modern physics. And Some people have suggested maybe morphic resonance could work through some of these extra dimensions, but I don't understand the theories, and so I don't know if that. So I leave it as an open question, as exactly how it might work.
Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating evening. I've certainly learned to think a little differently. You talked earlier about consciousness, fascinating concept, and how perhaps the sun has consciousness, or the galaxy has consciousness. Now, if we are conscious, and I know everybody here is conscious because everybody, including yourself, we express ourselves. Now, if we see a person who is conscious but has lost all parts of expression, we think of that as the most tragic situation to be in. If the sun has consciousness, how does it express it? And if it doesn't express it, what's the point?
Oh, well, that's a very good question, because nearly all our conscious activity is directed toward, well, a lot of it anyway, is directed toward possible actions. When you see something, just naming it is a possible action. So consciousness is closely related to action, except, of course, in mystical states and so on. But I mean, in practical terms, that's what it's about. It's choosing among possible actions. Now, in the case of the sun, what possible actions can it make? Well, the sun, it turns out, is an incredibly complex system with extremely complex rhythms and patterns of electromagnetic activity. It has 11-year cycles. The sunspot cycles, the sunspot minimum. We're in a minimum now. The sunspots have been exceptionally inactive for the last few years when they should have been much more active. There was a period in the 17th century when there was a very low sunspot activity called the Maunder minimum. For almost 70 years there were hardly any sunspots. We're in a sunspot minimum now where we should be at a maximum. It's a very low maximum. So not only do the sunspots change and vary, where they appear on the sun varies, and they're related to solar flares and coronal mass ejections. The sun has huge electromagnetic arcs, and it spits out vast quantities of radiation and material particles in solar flares. And in coronal mass ejections, there's sort of billions of tons of matter. The solar wind, which hits the Earth all the time, is caused by this spitting out, not just of radiation, but matter from the sun's surface. It's intermittent. If a coronal mass ejection is pointed towards the Earth, it would probably cause our entire power system to melt down and cause total chaos on Earth. Now, if the sun thought, okay, now I've had enough of these people on Earth, they needed to be taught a lesson. To direct a coronal mass ejection this way would be an incredibly effective way of doing it. We've now got huge power transmission systems which are hugely vulnerable to this. I mean, it's like vast areas over the whole of the national grid. All over the world, they're getting more and more complex. They're like huge areas for this. It affects the northern lights, of course, the aurora borealis. But in these, it affects all our electrical systems, including radio transmission. The sun could shut us down any time it wanted. So the way that it ejects things, it's the way it acts from time to time on the sun, where it points out these. So that's one way in which the sun's mind could be expressed. Now there may be lots of other ways too to do with electromagnetic pulses, the way the activity is getting on with it, and the way that it's relating to other stars. We may not know much about that. It's communicating by light, of course, and also else in the X-ray spectrum and other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. But it's certainly not just a constant blazing sun. It has a huge amount of activity, and the more that we look at the electromagnetic patterns on the sun, the more complex it becomes, and the more unpredictable it becomes. No one predicted this low minimum that we've got at the moment. And it affects global warming.
It's not very in the Euro crisis.
Yes, well, the Euro crisis is pretty small compared with what happened to the sun. But if the sun, we're all in the electromagnetic field of the sun. The light is in the electromagnetic, but even when it's night, like now, we're in the electromagnetic field of the sun. Your brain is in the electromagnetic field of the sun. We don't know how much the sun can know of what's happening within its sphere of influence, but we're all in its field. And everything that happens electromagnetically in our brains, when we switch the lights off or armour off, the things happening on computers and TV sets, all of those are electromagnetic patterns within the electromagnetic field of the sun.
Well,
So
never
just don't know
going to
what
happen
extent
without
it may be
sun.
conscious or what extent it may be active. And we can assume that it isn't conscious and it's not doing anything. That's the usual assumption, but it may be wrong. Yes, I think so. So over to you then.
Ladies and gentlemen,